The theme of my conversation is the new scenarios in Italy and in Europe during and after the coronavirus crisis. I will not speak about this theme from a medical or scientific point of view, as I do not have this competence. I will instead consider the argument from three other points of view: the point of view of a scholar of the political and social sciences, the point of view of a historian, and the point of view of a philosopher of history. And of course, the political and social sciences, as we know, study human behavior in its social, political and geopolitical context. And from this point of view, I'm not inquiring into the origins of the coronavirus and its nature, but rather the social consequences that are happening and will happen. An epidemic is the diffusion on the national or world scale, in this case it's called a pandemic, of an infective illness that afflicts a large number of individuals of a determined population in a very brief span of time. And the coronavirus, which has been renamed COVID-19, is an infective illness that began to spread through the world from China. Italy is, since now, the Western nation that is apparently the most afflicted by it. Why is Italy under quarantine today? Because, as the most attentive observers have understood from the very beginning, the problem of coronavirus is not its fatality rate, but the rapidity with which the contagion spreads among the population. Everyone agrees that the illness in itself is not terribly lethal. A sick person who contracts the coronavirus and is assisted by specialized healthcare personnel in well-equipped healthcare facilities can heal. But if, because of the rapid spread of the contagion, which can potentially strike millions of people simultaneously, the number of sick people rapidly increases, there will not be enough healthcare facilities and personnel. The sick will die because they are deprived of the necessary care in order to cure grave cases, and it is necessary to support with intensive care, ventilating the lungs. If this support is lacking, the patients die. If the number of those who are sick increases, healthcare structures are not capable of offering intensive care to everyone, and an ever greater number of patients will succumb to the disease. Epidemiological projections are inexorable, and they justify the precautions being taken. If uncontrolled, the coronavirus could strike the entire Italian population. But let's say that in the end only 30% become infected. That would be about 20 million people. Let's say that out of this reducing the rate, 10% go into crisis, meaning that without intensive care they will succumb to the disease. This would mean that 2 million people die directly, plus all of those who will die indirectly as a result of the collapse of the healthcare system and the social and economic order. The collapse of the healthcare system in turn would have other consequences. The first is the collapse of the nation's productive system. Economic crises usually arise from the lack of either supply or demand. But if those who want to consume must remain at home and the stores are closed, and those who are capable of selling goods do not succeed in getting their product to their clients, because logistical operations, the transport of goods and points of sale like stores enter into crisis, this supply chain collapses. The central banks would not be capable of saving such a situation. The crisis after the coronavirus does not have a monetary solution, writes Maurizio Ricci, an Italian journalist, on La Repubblica. The expression perfect storm was coined several years ago by the economist Nouriel Roubini to indicate a mix of financial conditions that are such that it leads to a collapse of the market. There will be a global recession due to coronavirus, Roubini declares, adding, this crisis will spill over and result in a disaster. The weak point of globalization is interconnection, the talisman word of our time, from the economy to religion. Pope Francis' Querida Amazonia is a hymn to interconnection. But today, the global system is fragile precisely because it is so interconnected. And the system of distribution of products is one of the chains of this economic interconnection. It is not a problem of the markets, but of a real economy. Not only finance, but also industry, commerce, and agriculture, that is to say, the pillars of the economy of a nation, can all collapse in the system of production, and the distribution enters into a crisis. But there is another point that begins to be glimpsed. There is not only the collapse of the health system, there is not only a possible crack in the economy, but there can also be a collapse of the state and public authority. In a word, social anarchy. The riots in Italian prisons indicate a trend in this direction. Epidemics have psychological consequences because of the panic that they can provoke. Between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, social psychology was born as a science. One of its first exponents was Gustave Le Bon, the author of a famous book entitled Psychology of Crowds. Analyzing collective behavior, Le Bon explains how in a crowd the individual undergoes a psychological change by which feelings and passions are transmitted from one individual to another by contagion, like that which happens with infectious diseases. The modern theory of contagion, which was inspired by Le Bon, explains how, protected by the anonymity of a crowd, the most calm individual can become aggressive, acting at the suggestion of others or in imitation of them. Panic is one of those feelings that is spread by social contagion, has happened during the French Revolution in the period that was called the Great Fear. If a health crisis is compounded by an economic crisis, an uncontrolled wave of panic can trigger the violent impulses of the crowd. The state is then replaced by tribes and gangs, especially in the outskirts of large urban centers. The social war has been theorized by the San Paul Forum, a conference of Latin American ultra-leftist organizations, and is practiced in Latin America from Bolivia to Chile, from Venezuela to Ecuador, and may soon expand to Europe. What emerges defeated from this crisis is the utopia of globalization, presented as the great road destined to lead to the unification of the human race. Globalization actually destroys space and pulverizes distances. Today, the key to escaping the epidemic is social distance, the isolation of the individual. The quarantine is diametrically opposed to the open society hoped for by George Soros. Pope Francis, after the failure of Querida Amazonia, focused heavily on the conference dedicated to the Global Compact, scheduled at the Vatican for this coming May the 14th. This conference, however, has been rescheduled and has become more distant, not only in time, but in its ideological presuppositions. The coronavirus brings us back to reality. It is not the end of borders that was announced after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Instead, it is the end of the world without borders, the end of the global village. It is not the triumph of the New World Order, it is the triumph of the New World Disorder. The political and social scenario is that of a society that is disintegrating and decomposing. It is all organized, it is possible, but history is not a deterministic succession of events. The master of history is God, not the masters of chaos. The killer of globalization is a global virus called the coronavirus. At this point, the historian will step in to replace the political observer, seeking to see things from the perspective of a greater chronological distance. Epidemics have accompanied the history of humanity from the very beginning, all the way and to the 20th century, and they are always intertwined with two other scourges, wars and economic crisis. The last great epidemic, the Spanish flu in 1920, was closely connected to the First World War and the Great Depression that began in 1929, also known as the Great Crash, an economic and a financial crisis that convulsed the economic world at the end of the 20s with grave repercussions that extended throughout the 1930s. These events were followed by the Second World War. Laura Spinney is an English scientific journalist who has written a book called Pale Rider, the Spanish flu of 1918 and how it changed the world. Her book informs us that between 1918 and 1920, the virus, which began in Spain, infected approximately 500 million people, including even inhabitants of remote islands of the Pacific Ocean and of the glacial Arctic Sea, causing the deaths of 100 million individuals, 10 times more than the First World War. In the connected world of globalization, the ease with which contagion can spread is certainly greater than it was a century ago. Who can deny it? But the historian's perspective goes even further back in time. The 20th century was the most terrible century of history, but there was another terrible century, the calamitous 14th century, as Barbara Tuchman calls it in her book, A Distant Mirror. I would like to focus on this historical period that marked the end of the medieval era and the beginning of the modern era. I do so basing myself on historical works that are not Catholic, but serious and objective in their research. The rogations are processions convoked by the Church in order to implore the help of heaven against calamities. The rogations contain the prayer "A fame, peste et bello, libera nos Domine." From famine, plague, and war, deliver us, O Lord. As the historian Robert Lopez writes, the liturgical invocation present in the rogation ceremonies unfolded with all of its drama over the course of the 14th century. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, the Middle Age, Lopez observes, none of the great scourges that mowed down humanity seem to have raged in any great measure. Neither pestilence, of which there is no mention during this period, nor famine, nor war, which had a greatly reduced number of victims. Moreover, the expanse of agriculture was widened by a slow softening of the climate. We have proof of this in the retreat of the glaciers in the mountains and of the icebergs in the North Seas, in the extension of wine growing into regions like England, where today is no longer practical, and in the abundance of water in regions of the Sahara that were later reconquered by the desert. The picture of the 14th century was much, much different, as natural catastrophes combined with serious religious and political upheavals. The 14th century was a century of deep religious crisis. It opened in 1303 with the famous slap of Anagni against Boniface VIII, one of the greatest humiliations of the papacy in history. It saw the transference of the papacy for 70 years to the city of Avignon in France, and it ended with 40 years of the Western Schism from 1378 to 1417, where Catholic Europe was divided between 2 and then 3 popes, and a century late, the Protestant Revolution lacerated the unity of the faith of Christianity. If the 13th century was a period of peace in Europe, the 14th century was an era of permanent war. We need only think of the 100 Years' War between France and England, and of the assault of the Turks against the Byzantine Empire with the conquest of Adrianople, 1362. In this century, Europe experienced also an economic crisis due to climatic changes caused not by man, but by glaciation. The climate of the Middle Ages had been mild and sweet, like its customs, but the 14th century experienced an abrupt harshening of climatic conditions. The rains and floods of the spring of 1315 led to a general famine that assailed all of Europe, above all the northern regions, causing the death of millions of people. The famine spread everywhere. The elderly voluntarily refused the food in the hope of enabling the young to survive, and historians of the time write of many cases of cannibalism. One of the principal consequences of the famines was agriculture destructuring. In this period, there were great movement of agriculture depopulation characterized by flight from the land and the abandonment of the villages. The forest invaded the fields and the vineyards. As a result of the abandonment of the fields, there was a strong reduction of soil productivity. If bad weather causes famine, the subsequent weakening of the body of entire populations causes disease. The historians Ruggero Romano and Alberto Tenenti show how in the 14th century the recurring cycle of famines and epidemics intensified. The plague came from the Orient and arrived in Constantinople in the autumn of 1347. Over the next 3 years, it infected all of Europe, all the way to Scandinavia and Poland. It was the Black Plague, of which Boccaccio speaks in the Decameron. The European population that had surpassed 70 million inhabitants at the beginning of the 14th century was reduced by a century of wars, epidemics and famines to 40 million. It shrank by more than 1/3. The famines, plague and wars of the 14th century were interpreted by the Christian people as signs of God's chastisement. Saint Bernardine of Siena admonished, "Tria sunt flagella quibus Dominus castigat." There are 3 scourges with which God chastises: war, plague, and famine. Saint Bernardine belongs to a number of saints like Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, Vincent Ferrer, Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort, who warned how throughout history natural disasters have always accompanied the infidelities and apostasy of nations. It happened at the end of Christian Middle Ages, and it seems to be happening today. Saints like Bernardine of Siena did not attribute these events to the work of evil agents, but to the sins of men, which are even more grave if they are collective sins, and still more grave if tolerated or promoted by the rulers of the peoples and by those who govern the Church. These considerations introduce us to the third point, in which I will consider the events not as a sociologist or historian, but as a philosopher of history. Theology and the philosophy of history are fields of intellectual speculation that apply the principles of theology and philosophy to historical events. The theologian of history is like an eagle that judges human affairs from the heights. Some of the great theologians of history were Saint Augustine, Jacques Bénigne Bossuet, who was called the Eagle of Meaux from the name of the diocese where he was bishop, and Count Joseph de Maistre, the Marquise Juan Donoso Cortés, the Abbot of Solesmes, Dom Prosper Guéranger, Professor Plinio Correa de Oliveira, and many others. There is a biblical expression that says, Iudicia Dei abyssus multa. The judgments of God are a great abyss. The theologian of history submits himself to these judgments and seeks to understand the reason for them. Saint Gregory the Great, inviting us to investigate the reasons for divine action, affirms, whoever does not discover the reason for which God thus thinks in the very works themselves will find in his own meanness and baseness sufficient cause to explain why his investigations are in vain. Philosophy and modern theology, under the influence above all of Hegel, have replaced the judgments of God with the judgments of history. The principle according to which the Church judges history is reversed. It is not the Church that judges history, but history that judges the Church, because the Church, according to the Nouvelle Theologie, does not transcend history, but is immanent, internal to itself. When Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini said in his final interview that the Church is 200 years behind with respect to history, he assumed history as the criterion of judgment for the Church. When Pope Francis, in his Christmas greetings to the Roman Curia on December the 21st, 2019, made these words of Cardinal Martini his own, he is judging the Church in the name of history, overturning what should be the criterion of Catholic judgment. History, in reality, is a creature of God, like nature, like all that exists, because nothing of what exists can exist apart from God. All that happens in history is foreseen, regulated, and ordered by God for all eternity. Thus, for the philosopher of history, every discussion can only begin with God and finish with God. God does not only exist, God is concerned for his creatures, and he rewards or chastises rational creatures according each one's merits or faults. The Catechism of St. Pius X teaches God rewards the good and chastises the wicked because his infinite justice. Justice, theologians explain, is one of the infinite perfections of God. The infinite mercy of God presupposed his infinite justice. Among Catholics, the concept of justice, like the concept of other concept, is removed, and yet the doctrine of the Church teaches the existence of a particular judgment that follows the death of every person, with the immediate reward or punishment of the soul, and of a universal judgment in which all angels and all human beings will be judged for their thoughts, words, actions, and omissions. The theology of history tells us that God rewards and punishes not only men, but also collectivities and social groups, families, nations, civilizations. But while men have their reward or chastisement, sometimes on earth, but always in heaven, nations which do not have an eternal life are punished or rewarded only on earth. God is righteous and rewarding and gives to each what is his due. He not only chastises individual persons, but he also sends tribulations to families, cities, and nations for the sins which they commit. Earthquakes, famines, epidemics, wars, and revolutions have always been considered as divine chastisements. As Father Ribadeneira writes, wars and plagues, droughts and famines, fires and all other disastrous calamities are chastisement for the sins of entire populations. On March the 5th, the bishop of an important Italian diocese, whom I will not name, declared, "One thing is certain, this virus was not sent by God to punish sinful humanity. It is effect of nature treating us as a stepmother, but God faces this phenomenon with us and probably will make us understand in the end that humanity is one single village." The Italian bishop does not renounce the myth of the single village, nor the religion of nature of the Pachamama, even if for him the great mother can become a stepmother. But the bishop, above all, forcefully rejects the idea that the coronavirus epidemic or any other collective disaster can be a punishment for humanity. The virus, the bishop believes, is only the effect of nature. But who is it that has created, ordered, and guided nature? God is the author of nature with its forces and its laws, and he has the power to arrange the mechanism of the forces and the laws of nature in such a way as to produce a phenomenon according to the needs of his justice or his mercy. God, who is the first cause above all of all that exists, always makes use of secondary causes in order to effect his plans. Whoever has a supernatural spirit does not stop at the superficial level of things, but seeks to understand the hidden design of God that is at work beneath the apparently blind force of nature. The great sin of our time is the loss of faith by the men of the church, not of this or that man of the church, but of the men of the church in their collective whole, with few exceptions, thanks to whom the church does not lose her visibility. This sin produces blindness of the mind and hardening of the heart, indifference to the violation of the divine order of the universe. It is an indifference that hides hatred toward God. How is it manifested? Not directly. These men of the church are too cowardly to directly challenge God. They prefer to express their hatred towards those who dare to speak of God. Whoever dares to speak of the chastisement of God gets stoned. A river of hatred flows against him. These men of the church, while verbally professing to believe in God, actually live immersed in practical atheism. They despoil God of all his attributes, reducing him to pure being that is to nothing. Yet not only sound theology, but the sensus fidei itself teaches that all physical and material evils that do not come from the will of man depend on the will of God. St. Alphonsus Liguori writes, "Everything that happens here against our will, know that it does not occur except by the will of God," as also St. Augustine says. On July the 19th, the Church's liturgy recalls Saint Lupus, Bishop of Troyes. He was the brother of Saint Vincent of Lérins and the brother-in-law of Saint Hilary of Arles. During his lengthy episcopate, Gaul was invaded by the Huns. Attila, king of the Huns, at the head of an army of 400,000 men, devastated everything and arrived before the city of Troyes when the bishop Lupus, vested in pontificals and following his clergy in procession, came to meet him and asked Attila, "Who are you that you threaten this city?" And the response came, "Don't you know who I am? I am Attila, king of the Huns, called the Scourge of God." To which Saint Lupus replied, "Well then, be the welcome, Scourge of God, because we merit divine scourges because of our sins. But if it is possible, let your blows fall only on my person and not on the entire city." The Huns entered the city of Troyes, but by divine will they were blinded and crossed it without being aware of it and without doing evil to anyone. The bishops today not only are not speaking about divine scourges, but they are not even inviting the faithful to pray that God will liberate us from the epidemic. There is a coherence in this. Whoever prays, in fact, asks God to intervene in his life, and thus in the things of the world, in order to be protected from evil and to obtain spiritual and material goods. But why should God listen to our prayers if he is disinterested in the universe created by him? Saint Charles Borromeo said, "Because of our sins, God permitted the fire of the plague to attack every part of Milan." And Saint Thomas Aquinas explains, "When it is all the people who sin, vengeance must be made on all the people, just as the Egyptians who persecuted the children of Israel were submerged in the Red Sea, and as the inhabitants of Sodom were struck down en masse, or a significant number of people must be struck, such as happened in the chastisement inflicted for the adoration of the golden calf." And on the eve of the second session of the First Vatican Council on January the 6th, 1870, St. John Bosco had a vision in which it was revealed to him that war, plague, and famine are the scourges with which the pride and the malice of man will be struck down. This is how the Lord expressed himself. "You, O priests, why do you not run to weep between the vestibule and the altar, begging for the end of the scourges? Why do you not take up the shield of faith and go over the roofs, in the houses, in the streets, in the squares, in every inaccessible place, to carry the seed of my word? Do you not know that this is the terrible two-edged sword that strikes down my enemies and that breaks the wrath of God and man?" Today the priests are silent, the bishops are silent, the Pope is silent. We are approaching Holy Week and Easter, and yet for the first time in many centuries in Italy, the churches are closed, masses are suspended, and even St. Peter's Basilica is closed. The Holy Week and Easter liturgies, Urbe et Orbi, will not be drawing pilgrims from all over the world. God also punishes by subtraction, as Saint Bernardine of Siena says. And today it seems like he has removed the churches, the mother of all churches, from the supreme pastor, while the Catholic people are groping confused in the dark, deprived of the light of truth that should illuminate the world from St. Peter's Basilica. How can we not see in what the coronavirus is producing a symbolic consequence of the self-destruction of the Church? Judicia cei abessus multa. We ought to be certain that what is happening does not prefigure the success of the sons of darkness, but rather their defeat. Because as Father Cattaneo, a Jesuit of the 17th century, explains, the number of sins, whether of a man or of a people, is numbered. Venit dies iniquitate prefinita, says the prophet Ezekiel. God is merciful, but there is a final sin that God does not tolerate and that provokes his chastisement. Furthermore, according to a principle of the theology of Christian history, the center of history is not the enemies of the Church, but the saints. Omnia sustineo propter electos, says St. Paul. History revolves around the elect of God, and history depends on the impenetrable designs of divine providence. Throughout history, there are those who oppose the law of God, whether men, groups, or organized societies, both public and secret, who work to destroy all that has been ordained by God. They are able to obtain apparent successes, but they will always ultimately be defeated. The scenario we have before us is apocalyptic, but Pius XII recalls that in the book of Revelation, St. John says, "Did not behold only the ruins caused by sin, war, famine, and death." He also saw in the first place the victory of Christ, and indeed the path of the Church throughout the centuries is a via crucis, but it is also always a march of triumph. Jesus Christus, heri and hodie, ipsa et in secula. Christ is your guide, says Pius X, from victory to victory, follow him. At Fatima, the Blessed Mother has revealed to us this scenario of our time, and she assured us of her triumph, with the humility of those who are aware that they can do nothing by their own strength, but also with the confidence of those who know that everything is possible with the help of God. We don't retreat, and we entrust ourselves to Mary at the tragic hour of the events foretold by the message of Fatima.